We are looking at the single biggest economic experiment of our lifetime. But the question isn't just what China achieved, but how they engineered it when the odds were stacked against them. I'm so glad you're here, because unlocking this mystery offers a masterclass in strategy and adaptability that we can all learn from. Let's begin the journey of decoding this transformation. To understand the towering skyscraper that China has become today, you must first stand in the rubble of its foundation. The story of modern China does not begin with gleaming cities and high-speed trains. It begins in the quiet, desperate darkness of a country that had stopped moving. To see the light that eventually flooded in, we must first be brave enough to look at the long night that came before 1978. Imagine a world where color has been drained away. In the China of the 1960s and 70s, almost everyone you met wore the same clothes. They were shapeless jackets and trousers in dull shades of blue, gray, or military green. This lack of color was a mirror of life itself. Individual choices were not allowed. You did not choose your job. You did not choose where you lived. You did not even choose what you ate for dinner. The state decided everything. It was a time when a great silence separated China from the rest of the planet. While other nations were inventing computers and landing on the moon, China was locked inside its own borders, struggling simply to feed its children. This era was shaped by one man more than any other, Chairman Mao Zedong. He was a leader of immense power who wanted to make China strong and modern, but his methods often led to catastrophic heartbreak. His first great attempt to change the country was called the Great Leap Forward. The name sounded hopeful, like a runner jumping over a hurdle. Mao believed that sheer willpower could overcome the laws of economics and nature. He wanted China to catch up with wealthy countries like Britain and America, not in a century, but in just 15 years. To do this, the government tried to turn a nation of farmers into a nation of steel workers overnight. It was a time of strange and tragic logic. Farmers were told to stop tending to their crops and start making steel in their backyards. Families took their metal woks, their iron stoves, and even their farming tools, and threw them into homemade fire pits to melt them down. The smoke turned the sky gray, but the metal they produced was useless, brittle lumps that could not be used to build anything. At the same time, the rules of farming were rewritten by people who had never held a plow. Farmers were forced into giant groups called communes. No one owned their own land anymore. You worked for the group, and you ate from a common pot. The experts in Beijing came up with new ideas that sounded smart on paper, but were deadly in the field. They told farmers to plant seeds very close together, believing the seeds would be happier with company. Instead, the plants choked each other and died. They waged a war against sparrows because the birds ate grain. But when the birds were gone, the insects multiplied and ate the crops. Then the weather turned bad, and the true horror began. Between 1958 and 1962, a great hunger swept across the land. It is a period that is hard to speak about even today. History tells us that 45 million people died during these years. It is a number so huge that the human mind struggles to hold it. It is the entire population of a large country, gone. In the villages, the common dining halls that had promised free food for everyone stood empty. People ate tree bark. They ate the grass that grew by the road. When that was gone, they ate the earth itself to fill the pain in their stomachs. The tragedy was made worse because local officials were too afraid to tell the truth. They sent reports to Beijing saying the harvest was record-breaking, while the people outside their windows were starving. It was a famine made not just by nature, but by fear and bad ideas. Just as the country began to catch its breath and recover from the hunger, another storm arrived. In 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. If the Great Leap Forward broke the body of China, the Cultural Revolution broke its spirit. Mao felt that the country was losing its revolutionary edge, so he called upon the young students to destroy the old ways. Schools and universities were shut down. For a decade, education stopped. Imagine a whole generation of children who were told that studying books was bad and that their teachers were enemies. Teenagers were given red armbands and told they were the Red Guards. They were encouraged to turn against anyone who represented authority or tradition. Students attacked their teachers. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Children were sometimes forced to denounce their own parents. The goal was to destroy the four olds, which were old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Temples were smashed. Precious artwork was burned in bonfires. Books were torn apart. But the most damaging thing that was destroyed was trust. In a society where your friend or your brother might report you to the authorities for saying the wrong thing, people learned to keep their mouths shut. They learned to wear a mask of obedience. The economy, which was already weak, ground to a halt because the managers and experts were sent to work in the fields to learn from the peasants. Factories had no one to run them. Trains stopped running on time. The chaos was absolute. During all this turmoil, China was like a house with the doors locked and the curtains drawn. The average person had no idea what was happening outside their borders. They did not know that in America, young people were listening to rock and roll and driving cars. They did not know that Japan, their neighbor, was rebuilding itself into a technology giant. The news on the radio in China only spoke of the greatness of the party and the evils of the outside world. Foreigners were rarely seen, and speaking to one could get you in terrible trouble. The poverty was deep and crushing. When we say that people lived on less than $2 a day, it does not quite capture the reality. Money itself meant very little because there was nothing to buy. If you wanted a bicycle, a sewing machine, or a watch, the three most desired items in a household, you needed to save for years, but you also needed a special coupon from the government giving you permission to buy it. Food was rationed with coupons too. A family might share a single light bulb. They might have meat only once a year during the spring festival. Life was a daily struggle just to stay warm and fed. By the late 1970s, the country was exhausted. The people were tired of the constant political campaigns. They were tired of the shouting and the fear. They were tired of being poor. The grand experiments had failed. The backyard furnaces were cold. The Red Guards had grown up and realized they had no skills and no jobs. Then, in 1976, the ground shifted beneath their feet. Chairman Mao died. The sun that had orbited the center of their lives for decades was gone. For a moment, there was a terrifying uncertainty. Would the chaos continue? Would there be a civil war? But in that silence, a realization began to form among the surviving leaders. They looked at their country and they looked at the world, and they saw the truth that had been hidden for so long. They saw that while they had been fighting each other, the world had left them behind. They saw that their neighbors in Asia were getting rich while China remained poor. They realized that the old way of doing things, where the government controlled every seed that was planted and every shoe that was made, was suffocating them. The economy was on the edge of collapse. The people had lost faith. It was a moment of absolute clarity. The leaders understood that they could not eat ideology. They could not build houses out of political slogans. They faced a choice that was terrifying in its simplicity. They could continue on the path they were on and watch their nation crumble into dust, or they could do the unthinkable. They could admit they were wrong. They could open the doors. They could try something completely different. This was the starting point. It was not a moment of triumph, but a moment of desperate necessity. It was rock bottom. The China of 1978 was a wounded giant, battered by 20 years of self-inflicted pain, standing at a crossroads with empty pockets and a hungry belly. It is only by understanding how deep this hole was that we can appreciate the climb that was about to begin. The stage was set for a new leader, a small man with a quiet voice and a pragmatic mind, to step forward and suggest that perhaps it was time to stop shouting slogans and start planting rice. The long night was ending, and the first gray light of dawn was about to break over the horizon. If the story of modern China were a movie, the first chapter would be a tragedy about a house on fire. The second chapter, however, introduces us to the unexpected hero who arrives to put out the flames and rebuild the structure. He was not a young, dashing revolutionary with a sword. He was an old man, barely 5 feet tall, with a quiet voice and a gentle smile. His name was Deng Xiaoping, and while he did not look like a giant, he would go on to cast the longest shadow over the 20th century. To understand why Deng Xiaoping mattered so much, we must remember where he came from. He was a survivor. During the chaotic years described in the previous chapter, Deng had been thrown out of power 3 separate times. He was humiliated, stripped of his titles, and sent away to work in a tractor factory. Most men would have been broken by this. They would have become bitter or angry. But Deng was different. He possessed a patience that was as deep as the ocean. While he turned wrenches in that factory, he was thinking. He was watching. He saw clearly that the old ways of shouting slogans and ignoring reality were destroying the country he loved. When he finally returned to power in the late 1970s, he was 74 years old. Most people that age are looking for a comfortable chair to rest in. Deng was looking to change the course of history. He brought with him a way of thinking that was shocking in its simplicity. For decades, China had been obsessed with political purity. Every decision, from how to plant rice to how to run a factory, was judged by whether it fit the strict rules of communist theory. People were terrified of doing anything that might look like the Western way of doing things. Deng cut through this fear with a single sentence that became famous around the world. He said that it does not matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice. This sounds like a simple folk saying, but in that time and place it was a thunderclap. He was telling his country that results mattered more than labels. The cat was the economic system. The mouse was the problem of poverty and hunger. Deng was saying that he did not care if a method looked like capitalism or socialism or something else entirely. If it fed the people and made the country strong, it was a good method. It was a declaration that the time for dreaming was over and the time for working had begun. However, Deng was also a man of great caution. He knew that China was fragile. The country had just been through years of madness and violence. If he tried to change everything too fast, the shock might break the nation apart again. He could not simply press a button and turn China into America or Japan overnight. He needed a strategy for moving forward without falling down. To explain this, he used another famous phrase. He said that they must cross the river by feeling the stones. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a wide, rushing river. You need to get to the other side, which represents a modern, wealthy country. But there is no bridge, there is no map. The water is murky and you cannot see the bottom. If you run blindly, the current will sweep you away. So you take one step, you put your foot down and feel for a stone on the riverbed. If the stone is steady, you put your weight on it. If it feels loose or slippery, you pull your foot back and try a different spot. This was Deng's philosophy of reform. He rejected the idea of a sudden revolution. He did not want to tear down the government or the party. Instead, he wanted to fix the system from the inside, one step at a time. This approach is what saved China from the fate of other nations that tried to change too quickly and collapsed into chaos. Deng decided that instead of guessing what would work for the whole country, they would run experiments. This was perhaps his smartest idea. In most countries, when the government makes a new law, it applies to everyone at once. If the law is bad, the whole country suffers. Deng changed this. He treated China like a giant laboratory. If someone had a new idea, like letting farmers sell their own vegetables or allowing a factory to keep its profits, Deng would say, "Try it in this one village first," or "Try it in this one city." They would watch what happened. If the experiment failed, they would shut it down and the damage would be small. But if it worked, and if the people in that village got richer, then they would expand the idea to the next town, and then the province, and finally the whole nation. This method took the fear out of change. It allowed the government to learn from its mistakes without destroying the economy. It was a way of moving forward that was slow, steady, and safe. But Deng faced a massive problem. He had to convince the other leaders in Beijing to agree with him. These were men who had spent their entire lives fighting against capitalism. They believed that private business and making money were the roots of all evil. How could he tell them to open markets and invite foreign companies in? Deng performed a masterstroke of persuasion. He realized that he could not call his new plan capitalism. That word was poison. So he did not use it. Instead, he redefined what socialism meant. He argued that the true purpose of socialism was to make the country distinct and powerful, and to improve the lives of the people. Poverty, he argued, was not socialism. Therefore, to be a good socialist, one had to get rich. He called this new system socialism with Chinese characteristics. It was a brilliant disguise. It allowed the hardline leaders to keep their dignity and their titles. They could tell themselves they were still building a socialist paradise, even as they adopted the tools of the free market. Deng convinced them that money, markets and trade were just tools, like a hammer or a wrench. A hammer does not have a political opinion. You can use a hammer to build a capitalist house or a communist house. Deng told them to pick up the hammer and start building. The official turning point came in December of 1978. The event was a meeting with a very long, boring name, the third plenary session of the 11th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. But what happened there was electric. In the smoky halls of the Great Hall of the People in Beijing, the direction of the wind changed. For years, the focus of the government had been on class struggle, essentially finding enemies within the country and fighting them. At this meeting, under Deng's guidance, the party officially decided to stop looking for enemies and start looking for prosperity. They declared that the main job of the government was no longer political revolution, but economic construction. The doors that had been bolted shut were unlocked. The heavy curtains were pulled back. Deng signaled that China was ready to learn from the world again. He sent students to foreign universities. He bought tickets for government officials to visit factories in Japan and the United States so they could see how far behind China had fallen. He was humble enough to admit that China needed help, but bold enough to believe that China could catch up. Deng Xiaoping's vision was not about creating a perfect world. He knew that opening the window to fresh air would also let in some flies. He knew that some people would get rich faster than others. He famously said, "Let some people get rich first," believing that their success would eventually pull everyone else up. It was a gamble. He was betting that the desire for a better life was stronger than the old political habits. By the time the meeting in 1978 ended, the ink was dry on the new plan. There were no parades, there were no fireworks. To the average person walking the streets of Beijing or working in the rice paddies of Sichuan, the day looked like any other. The sun rose and set, the bicycles drifted through the streets, but the ground beneath them had fundamentally changed. The engine of the massive ship that was China had been restarted, and the captain had turned the wheel toward a destination that no one had ever visited before. The era of the iron rice bowl, where the state provided everything but gave nothing of quality, was cracking. The era of reform and opening up had begun. Deng Xiaoping did not live to see the skyscrapers of Shanghai that touch the clouds today. He did not see the high-speed trains or the busy ports, but every single one of them stands on the foundation of the stones he felt for in the river. He was the quiet architect who looked at a broken nation and saw not what it was, but what it could be if only the people were set free to work for themselves. The story of how China fed itself begins not in a grand palace or a bustling factory, but in a broken mud hut on a freezing winter night. It is a story about the most basic human instinct, which is the drive to survive, and how a small group of desperate people discovered a secret that would eventually lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. To understand this revolution, we must first look at the soil of the Chinese countryside in the late 1970s, which was soaked in sweat but yielded almost nothing. For decades, the farmers of China had been living inside a system that sounded fair in theory, but was disastrous in practice. It was called the collective system. Imagine a world where no matter how hard you work, your reward is exactly the same as the person standing next to you who does nothing at all. The government owned the land. The government owned the tools. The government even owned the seeds. Farmers were organized into large teams, like soldiers in an army without guns. Every morning, a village leader would blow a whistle or ring a bell, and everyone would march out to the fields together. The problem was that the human spirit does not work well when it is treated like a machine. In these collectives, a farmer earned work points for showing up, not for doing a good job. If a man worked until his back broke and his hands bled, he got his ration of rice. If his neighbor hid in the shade of a tree and slept half the day, he also got his ration of rice. The result was inevitable. People stopped trying. Why would you waste your energy if it did not help your family eat better? The farmers described this as eating from the big pot. Since the food came from a shared pot, no one felt responsible for filling it. The fields were full of people, but they were empty of effort. Farmers would lean on their hoes and stare at the sky, waiting for the whistle to blow so they could go home. The crops were neglected. Weeds grew tall. And because the grain output was so low, the farmers were left with barely enough to keep themselves alive. In the province of Anhui, the situation was particularly grim. A terrible drought had struck, and the big pot was empty. Villagers were boiling poplar leaves and grinding dry husks just to put something in their stomachs. They were begging door to door in other towns. They were slowly dying, and the system that was supposed to protect them was the very thing holding them down. It was in this atmosphere of hopelessness that history turned a corner. The date was November 24th, 1978. The place was a tiny, impoverished hamlet called Xiaogang Village. The village was so poor that it was hardly a village at all, just a cluster of thatched roofs and mud walls. That night, 18 farmers crept into the largest house in the village. They moved in the shadows because what they were about to do was a crime. In the eyes of the government at that time, breaking up the collective land was considered counter-revolutionary. It was treason. If they were caught, they could be thrown in prison for years, or perhaps even executed. But they were starving, and the fear of watching their children die was stronger than their fear of the police. The room was dimly lit by a kerosene lamp. The men were gaunt, their faces worn by wind and hunger. They huddled together and wrote down a contract on a crumpled piece of yellow paper. It was short and simple, but it carried the weight of a declaration of independence. The agreement stated that they would secretly divide the commune's land among the 18 families. Each family would farm their own plot. The terms of the deal were specific. They promised to still give the government its required quota of grain. They promised to give the commune its share. But after those debts were paid, whatever was left over, every single grain of rice or wheat, would belong to the family that grew it. They would no longer eat from the big pot. They would eat from their own bowls. The end of the document contained a chilling promise. The farmers knew the danger they were in. They wrote that if any of them were arrested or killed for this action, the others promised to raise their children until they were 18 years old. One by one, the 18 men dipped their thumbs into a pot of red ink and pressed their prints onto the paper. The red circles looked like drops of blood, sealing a pact that was born of pure desperation. The next morning, everything changed. There was no whistle blowing to wake them up. The farmers did not need a whistle. They were out in the fields before the sun came up. For the first time in years, they were working for themselves. They cared for every stalk of grain as if it were gold because, to them, it was. Men and women carried heavy buckets of water and fertilizer with a new energy. They weeded the rows until their fingers were sore. They stayed in the fields until it was too dark to see. The neighbors in nearby villages were confused. They saw the people of Xiaogang working with a strange and frightening intensity. They did not know about the secret paper hidden in the roof of the mud hut. They only saw that the land in Xiaogang was turning green and lush, while their own fields remained thin and patchy. When the harvest came in the autumn of 1979, the results were so shocking that no one believed the numbers at first. In just 1 year, these 18 families had produced more grain than the entire village had produced in the previous 5 years combined. They had harvested 66 tons of food. For the first time in memory, the giant ceramic jars in their homes were overflowing with grain. They had enough to pay the government, enough to pay the commune, and still so much left over that they did not know where to store it. They had gone from beggars to having a surplus. The secret could not be kept. The pile of grain was too big to hide. Local officials soon found out what had happened. The initial reaction from some hardline leaders was anger. They wanted to punish the farmers for breaking the rules of socialism. They called it a return to capitalism and demanded that the farmers go back to the collective system. But the hunger in China was a powerful thing, and the success of Xiaogang was undeniable. News of the miracle in Xiaogang traveled up the chain of command until it reached the highest levels of leadership in Beijing. This was the moment where Deng Xiaoping's pragmatism saved the day. Instead of punishing the farmers, the reformist leaders looked at the massive harvest and asked a simple question. If these 18 uneducated farmers could double their food supply just by changing the rules, imagine what would happen if the whole country did the same. The leaders decided to protect the village. They allowed the experiment to continue. And then, like a spark falling into dry grass, the idea spread. It moved from Xiaogang to the next village, then to the whole county, and then across the province. Farmers everywhere began demanding the same deal. They wanted the household responsibility system, which was the fancy name the government eventually gave to this simple idea of keeping what you grow. It spread like wildfire because it worked. It did not require expensive new machines or foreign experts. It only required human nature. Across the vast plains of China, millions of farmers began to wake up early. The countryside, which had been silent and sullen, became a hive of activity. In just a few years, the chronic hunger that had plagued China for centuries began to disappear. Food production soared, markets filled with vegetables, pork and poultry that had rarely been seen before. The farmers had money in their pockets for the first time, which meant they could buy clothes and build better houses. This revolution of the soil taught the Chinese leadership a lesson that would shape the next 40 years of history. It taught them that the Chinese people did not need to be controlled like children. They needed to be unleashed. It proved that if you gave people the freedom to make their own choices and the right to keep the rewards of their hard work, they would move mountains. The pact of the 18 farmers in Xiaogang proved that the problem with China's economy was not the people, it was the system. By removing the heavy hand of the state from the plow, the government unlocked the energy of hundreds of millions of people. The document with the 18 red fingerprints is now kept in a museum in Beijing, treated with the same reverence as a sacred ancient scroll. It represents the moment when China stopped trying to force the world to fit a theory and started trusting its own people to build their own future. The farming revolution was the first domino to fall, creating the momentum that would eventually lead to factories, skyscrapers, and the modern superpower we see today. It all started with a few hungry men in a mud hut who just wanted to feed their families. If the farming revolution in the countryside was the spark that lit the fire of China's recovery, the creation of special economic zones was the engine that turned that fire into unstoppable forward motion. Chapter 4 brings us to the edge of the water, to the southern coast of China, where the leadership decided to perform a magic trick that had never been seen before in a communist country. They decided to build islands of capitalism inside a sea of socialism. To understand why this was necessary, you must picture the dilemma facing the Chinese government in 1980. They knew they needed money. They knew they needed modern machines. They knew they needed to learn how to run businesses like the rest of the world. But they were also deeply afraid. They worried that if they opened the doors to the West completely, the sudden flood of foreign ideas and foreign money would wash away their government and their beliefs. They feared that they would lose control. So, Deng Xiaoping and his team came up with a brilliant compromise. They would not open the whole house. They would just open a few windows. They would designate specific small areas where the old rules did not apply. Inside these lines, foreign companies could come in, build factories, and hire workers. Inside these lines, businesses could make a profit. But outside these lines, the rest of China would stay the same, protected from the shock of sudden change. These areas were called special economic zones. The most famous of these, and the one that became the symbol of China's rise, was a place called Shenzhen. If you go to Shenzhen today, you will see a city that looks like it was dropped from the future. It has towers of glass and steel that pierce the clouds. It has streets humming with electric cars and millions of people rushing to work in high-technology offices. It is one of the wealthiest and most modern cities on planet Earth. But if you had stood in that exact same spot in 1979, you would have seen nothing but mud, rice paddies, and ducks. Shenzhen was a sleepy collection of fishing villages. It had a population of only about 30,000 people. The houses were small and crumbling. The roads were dirt tracks. It was a place where people lived in deep poverty. However, it had one incredibly important advantage. It was located right next to Hong Kong. At that time, Hong Kong was ruled by the British and was already a wealthy, glittering city. The people in Shenzhen could stand on the shore and look across the water at the bright neon lights of Hong Kong. They could see a world of plenty just a few miles away, while they lived in the dark. Many people were so desperate that they tried to swim across the bay to escape, risking their lives to reach the other side. Deng Xiaoping looked at this spot and drew a circle on the map. He decided that Shenzhen would be the first laboratory. The government cleared the land and announced to the world that this place was open for business. The offer they made to foreign companies was simple and irresistible. In the rest of China, the taxes were high and the red tape was thick. But in the special economic zone, the government lowered the taxes drastically. They told foreign businessmen that if they built a factory in Shenzhen, they would get to keep more of their money. Even more important than taxes were the rules about people. In the rest of China, you could not really fire a worker. A job was for life, known as the iron rice bowl. But in the zone, the government allowed a new system. Managers could hire people based on skill. They could pay people based on how hard they worked. And if the business was bad or the worker was lazy, they could let them go. This was normal in the West, but in China, it was a radical revolution. Foreign companies, especially those from Hong Kong and Taiwan, rushed across the border. They had the money and the knowledge, but they needed cheap land and many workers. Shenzhen had plenty of both. Suddenly, the quiet fishing village was filled with the roar of bulldozers and the banging of hammers. The transformation was so fast that people coined a new phrase for it. They called it Shenzhen speed. There was a saying that a new building was finished every 3 days. Hills were flattened to make room for factories. Dust filled the air, which was the smell of money being made. However, the genius of this plan was not just in the building, it was in the separation. The government built a physical fence around Shenzhen. It was made of barbed wire and had guarded checkpoints. It was a border within a border. This was the clever trick. To enter Shenzhen from the rest of China, a Chinese citizen needed a special pass. It was almost like going to a different country. This fence served a vital purpose. It meant that if the experiment went wrong, if the capitalism caused chaos or crime or too much inequality, the problems would be trapped inside the fence. The rest of China would remain safe. The leaders in Beijing could sleep at night knowing that the dangerous experiment was contained. It was like testing a new medicine in a petri dish before giving it to the patient. But the experiment did not go wrong. It succeeded beyond the wildest imagination of even the most optimistic leaders. As the factories opened, a human tide began to flow toward the zone. Young people from poor villages deep inside China heard rumors of the jobs in Shenzhen. They heard that if you worked hard in a shoe factory or an electronics assembly line, you could send money home to build a new house for your parents. They boarded trains and buses, traveling for days to reach the gates of the special zone. Inside the zone, the energy was electric. It was the Wild West of the East. People were working 12 or 14 hours a day, but for the first time, they were getting paid in real cash. The factories churned out toys, clothes, and watches that were shipped all over the world. The money earned from these exports stayed in China. The local government used the tax money to build paved roads, power plants, and schools. The success of Shenzhen proved that the Chinese people were not poor because they were unable to work. They were poor because the old system had stopped them from working. Once the heavy rules were lifted, their natural drive to improve their lives took over. Foreign companies were happy because they could make products cheaper than ever before. The Chinese government was happy because they were getting rich and learning valuable secrets. Every foreign factory was like a school. Chinese workers and managers watched how the Americans and Japanese ran their assembly lines. They learned about quality control. They learned about supply chains. They soaked up knowledge like a dry sponge in water. When the leaders in Beijing saw the explosion of wealth in Shenzhen, they realized that the experiment was a winner. The fear of capitalism began to fade. They saw that they could control the process. They saw that the cat was indeed catching mice. So, they decided to open the window wider. They did not tear down the fence immediately, but they took the map and drew more circles. They created similar zones in other coastal cities like Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen. Later, they opened 14 more coastal cities to foreign investment, including Shanghai. The success of Shenzhen became a beacon for the whole country. It showed every mayor and every governor in China what was possible. It created a model of competition. Cities began to compete with each other to see who could attract the most investors. They cleared land, improved their power grids, and promised better treatment for businesses. This chapter of the story is crucial because it explains how China managed to change without breaking. Other communist countries like the Soviet Union tried to change everything at once and fell apart. China used the special economic zones to test the water with one toe before jumping in. Shenzhen grew from a village of 30,000 to a metropolis of over 12 million people in just 30 years. It is the fastest growing city in the history of the human race. It stands today as a monument to the power of the special economic zone idea. It proved that if you create a space where rules are simple, taxes are fair, and hard work is rewarded, you can turn mud into gold. By the mid-1980s, the magic of the zones was no longer a secret. The engine was running hot, the factories were humming. Ships were leaving the ports heavy with goods. China had successfully invited the world into its living room, but it had done so on its own terms, ensuring that the guests paid for the privilege of being there. The foundation for the factory of the world had been poured, and the concrete was setting fast. By the early 1980s, China had successfully restarted its heart. The farmers were feeding the nation, and the first special zones were buzzing with activity. But the leaders in Beijing faced a new and difficult reality. They realized that ambition alone was not enough to build a modern country. You can have millions of willing workers and vast stretches of land, but if you do not have the right tools, you cannot build a skyscraper. You cannot build a computer if you have never seen a microchip. China was like a talented carpenter who had lost his toolbox. The country had been cut off from the world for so long that its technology was decades behind. The factories were using machines that belonged in museums. The engineers were brilliant, but they were working with blueprints from the 1950s. To catch up, China needed two things that it did not have. It needed money, specifically foreign currency like American dollars, to buy things from the global market. And even more importantly, it needed knowledge. It needed to know how the rest of the world made cars that did not break down, televisions that showed clear pictures, and shoes that were comfortable to wear. The solution was obvious but dangerous. They had to invite the foreigners in. They had to ask the wealthy companies of America, Europe, and Japan to bring their money and their machines to China. But this carried a great risk. The Chinese leadership remembered history well. They remembered a time when foreign powers had carved up China and treated its people as second-class citizens in their own land. They were terrified that if they opened the door too wide, these giant foreign companies would come in and take over. They worried that China would become a colony again, ruled not by armies, but by bank accounts. So they designed a master plan. They would open the door, but they would keep the chain on the latch. They would invite the world in, but only on strict terms. It was a strategy of great caution and great cleverness. The government created a system known as the joint venture. This was the key that unlocked the door. The rule was simple. If a foreign company like Volkswagen or Coca-Cola wanted to build a factory in China, they were often not allowed to do it alone. They had to find a Chinese partner. Usually this partner was a company owned by the government. The two sides would form a marriage. The foreign company would bring the money, the advanced machines, and the management skills. The Chinese partner would provide the land, the factory building, and the workers. This arrangement solved the fear of losing control. In many of these deals, the Chinese side kept the majority share of the company. It meant that the foreigners were guests in the house, not the owners of the house. But why would the big, powerful companies of the West agree to this? Why would they share their profits with a local partner? The answer was simple. The prize was too big to ignore. China offered something that no other country on earth could offer. It offered a market of 1 billion people. The foreign executives looked at China and did not see poverty. They saw potential. They saw 1 billion pairs of feet that needed shoes. They saw millions of families that wanted to buy their first refrigerator. They saw a future where every person might drink a bottle of soda or use a tube of toothpaste. To get access to this massive group of customers, the foreign companies were willing to accept almost any rules the government set. The most brilliant part of this strategy was a policy that can be described as trading the market for technology. The Chinese government said to the foreigners that if they wanted to sell their cars or computers to Chinese people, they had to teach Chinese workers how to make them. They could not just ship finished products into the country. They had to build the factories in China, and they had to bring their blueprints with them. Consider the car industry. When companies like Jeep and Volkswagen arrived, they found a country where cars were made by hand, almost like sculptures, with workers hammering metal sheets into shape. It took weeks to make a single car. The foreign companies brought in assembly lines. They brought in robots that could weld metal. They brought in strict systems for checking quality. But the deal required them to share these secrets. Chinese engineers stood next to German and American engineers. They watched. They took notes. They learned how to organize a supply chain so that every screw and bolt arrived exactly when it was needed. They learned the chemistry of making better tires. It was the greatest transfer of knowledge in industrial history. The factory floor became a university. The tuition fee was the profit the foreign companies made, but the degree the Chinese workers earned was priceless. Soon, the biggest names in the business world began to pack their bags. Toyota came to build cars. Nike came to stitch sneakers. Apple eventually came to assemble its phones. They came because the cost of labor in China was incredibly low. A worker in America might cost $20 an hour, while a worker in China might cost less than $1 an hour. This difference meant that companies could make their products for a fraction of the cost and sell them for a huge profit. But they also came because the Chinese government made it easy for them. Once the decision was made to welcome a company, the red carpet was rolled out. If a company needed a road to their new factory, the government built it. If they needed steady electricity, the government built a power plant. There were no strikes to worry about. There were no long legal battles. The stability of the country was a major attraction for nervous investors who wanted to be sure their factories would be safe. As these companies set up shop, a profound change happened to the people working inside them. Millions of young men and women moved from the slow rhythm of the farm to the fast rhythm of the modern factory. This was not just about learning to operate a machine. It was about learning the culture of modern industry. They learned about punctuality. They learned about efficiency. They learned that a product had to be perfect every single time. A young woman who spent 5 years sewing shirts for a Western brand learned how a clothing business worked. She saw how the fabrics were ordered. She saw how the designs were chosen. She saw how the final products were packed and shipped. Years later, many of these same workers would take that knowledge and start their own small factories, making their own brands. This was the hidden benefit of the foreign investment. It planted seeds of knowledge in the minds of millions of people. The amount of money that flowed into China was staggering. It started as a trickle in the early 80s, but by the 90s and 2000s, it was a flood. Billions upon billions of dollars poured into the economy. This money did not just sit in bank vaults. It went into the hands of construction workers who built the new plants. It went into the taxes that paid for new schools and hospitals. It created a cycle of wealth. The foreign companies paid wages. The workers spent those wages in local shops, and the local shops bought goods from other factories. This influx of foreign capital acted like fuel for a rocket. It allowed China to skip unmatched steps in development. Instead of spending 50 years inventing their own way to make a color television, they simply invited a Japanese company to show them how, and then they mastered it in 5 years. They swallowed their pride to learn from others. The landscape of Chinese cities began to change. In the streets where only bicycles had roamed, billboards for American soft drinks and French fashion began to appear. The skyline was no longer just grey concrete. It was lit up with the neon logos of the world's most famous brands. However, the relationship was not always perfect. There were arguments. The foreign companies sometimes complained that their secrets were being stolen, or that the rules were changed unfairly. The Chinese government sometimes worried that the foreigners were making too much money or treating workers poorly. But despite the friction, the marriage held together because both sides needed each other. The foreigners needed the cheap labor and the huge market. China needed the money and the modernization. By the time the 21st century arrived, the student had become a master. China was no longer just assembling parts made elsewhere. It was making the parts itself. The factories that had started as joint ventures were now surrounded by Chinese-owned factories that were just as good, if not better. The market for technology strategy had worked. China had absorbed the wisdom of the world without selling its soul. This chapter of Opening the Door is essential to the story because it explains the speed of China's rise. It was not a miracle of invention, it was a miracle of learning. By humbling themselves to become the apprentices of the global economy, the Chinese people gained the skills they needed to eventually become the leaders. The foreign investment was the starter motor that cranked the massive engine of the Chinese economy. An engine that, once started, would run faster and harder than anything the world had ever seen. If you pick up almost any object within your reach right now, whether it is the pen on your desk, the shoes on your feet, or the phone in your pocket, there is a very high chance you will find 3 small words printed somewhere on it. Made in China. These 3 words have become the most famous phrase in the modern world, appearing more often than any slogan or brand name. They are the watermark of our time. But the story of how those words ended up on everything from toothbrushes to televisions is not just a story about factories. It is a story about how a single nation transformed itself into the engine room of the entire planet. Chapter 6 takes us into the roaring heart of this transformation. By the turn of the millennium, China had moved beyond just feeding itself and experimenting with small zones. It was ready to take on a much bigger role. It was ready to become the workshop for the world. To understand how this happened, we must look at the perfect storm of people, planning, and timing that came together to create the greatest manufacturing machine in human history. The first and most powerful ingredient in this machine was the sheer number of people. It is hard for the human mind to truly grasp what 1.4 billion people looks like. It is a number so large that it creates its own gravity. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a massive wave of humanity was moving from the quiet countryside to the bustling coastal cities. These were people who had grown up in poverty, often working on small farms where life was hard and money was scarce. They were hungry for a better life. They were willing to work long hours for wages that would seem impossibly low to a worker in America or Europe, but which seemed like a fortune to them. This vast ocean of labor gave China an advantage that no other country could match. When a factory owner in the United States wanted to hire 1,000 workers to make toys for Christmas, it might take him months to find them. In China, he could find them in a few days. There was always someone ready to step onto the assembly line. This meant that factories could run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, in 3 shifts. The machines never had to turn off. The lights never had to go out. But cheap labor was only one part of the puzzle. If cheap workers were the only thing that mattered, then factories would have moved to many other poor countries. China had something else. It had a genius for organization. This is often called the cluster effect. Imagine you want to make a winter coat. To make that coat, you need fabric, buttons, zippers, thread, and lining. In most parts of the world, you might have to buy the fabric from one city, the buttons from another country, and the zippers from a third place. You would have to wait for weeks for all the parts to arrive before you could start sewing. In China, they built entire cities dedicated to making just one thing. There is a town called Datang that makes 1/3 of all the socks in the world. There is a town called Chaotu that is known as the button capital of the world. Because all the suppliers were right next door to each other, a factory owner could order buttons in the morning and have them delivered before lunch. This speed was incredible. It allowed companies to change designs instantly. If a fashion trend changed in Paris or New York, the factories in China could have the new style made and shipped before the trend even ended. This efficiency was the secret weapon that made Chinese goods not just cheap, but also fast. However, making millions of tons of goods is useless if you cannot move them. This brings us to the third pillar of the export machine, which was infrastructure. The government of China understood that time is money. They looked at their country and saw that the old dirt roads and slow trains were choking the economy. So, they began a construction project of epic proportions. They poured concrete like water. They built highways that sliced through mountains and bridged over valleys. They built railways that connected the deep interior of the country to the coast. Most importantly, they built ports. If you look at a list of the 10 busiest shipping ports in the world today, almost all of them are in China. These ports are not just docks. They are giant, automated cities of steel cranes and shipping containers. The port of Shanghai, for example, became a monster of efficiency. Ships the size of skyscrapers would dock, and thousands of containers would be loaded in a synchronized dance that barely paused for breath. This meant that a plastic doll made in a factory in Guangdong could be placed in a container, driven to a port, loaded onto a ship, and arrive in a store in California for a price that was lower than the cost of a cup of coffee. The cost of shipping became so low that it no longer acted as a barrier. It became cheaper to catch a fish in Europe, freeze it, ship it to China to be filleted by hand, and then ship it back to Europe, than to do the work in Europe itself. This machine was already humming when a pivotal moment arrived in 2001. This was the year China joined the World Trade Organization. For 15 years, China had been knocking on the door of this club, asking to be let in. The World Trade Organization is the group that sets the rules for trade between countries. Before joining, China faced high taxes, known as tariffs, when it tried to sell its goods to other countries. There was always a fear that the rules might change overnight. When China finally joined, it was like a wedding between the Chinese economy and the global economy. The trade barriers fell down, the uncertainty vanished. Foreign companies felt safe. They knew that the rules were now fixed. This opened the floodgates. Investment poured in, and exports poured out. The chart of China's economic growth after 2001 looks like a mountain climber scaling a vertical cliff. It went straight up. Western companies realized they had no choice. If they wanted to survive, they had to be in China. Companies like Walmart and Target began to source almost everything from Chinese factories. They sent their buyers to trade fairs in cities like Guangzhou, where halls the size of airports were filled with every product imaginable. You could walk for miles and see nothing but rows of blenders, then rows of toaster ovens, then rows of bicycles. The world needed what China was producing. In the United States and Europe, the wages of middle-class workers had stopped growing effectively. People felt squeezed. But suddenly, the stores were full of goods that were incredibly affordable. A DVD player that used to cost hundreds of dollars dropped to $30. Clothes became so cheap that people could buy new outfits every season. This created a symbiotic relationship. The West got cheap goods that kept inflation low and consumers happy. And China got the jobs and the money it needed to rebuild its nation. This era saw the label Made in China change its meaning. In the beginning, it was often associated with cheap, low-quality plastic trinkets that broke easily. But as the years went on, the quality improved. The workers learned. The machines got better. Soon, Made in China was on high-end computers. It was on solar panels. It was on precision medical equipment. The country moved from making simple toys to making the most complex electronics on Earth. The impact of this export machine on the Chinese people was profound. It created a new class of people. The factory girls and assembly line boys sent billions of dollars back to their home villages. This money built new brick houses to replace the old mud ones. It paid for brothers and sisters to go to school. It was a hard life, filled with long hours and repetitive motion, but it was a ladder out of the mud. For the first time in history, a peasant farmer's son could dream of working in a city, saving money, and perhaps one day opening a small business of his own. By becoming the world's factory, China also made itself essential. It wove itself into the fabric of daily life in every country on the map. If the factories in China stopped working, shelves around the world would go empty. Construction sites in Dubai would run out of steel. Hospitals in London would run out of masks. Tech companies in California would run out of chips. The sheer scale of this achievement is something that history will marvel at for centuries. In the span of a single generation, China transformed from a nation that could barely make a tractor into a nation that makes everything. They did it by leveraging their greatest resource, their people, and by building a logistics network that flowed like a river of commerce. They turned the phrase "Made in China" from a warning label into a statement of global dominance. Chapter 6 is the story of the muscle behind the miracle. It is the story of the ships, the trucks, the sewing machines, and the hands that powered them. It explains how the world became smaller and how China became bigger, until the two were so tightly locked together that they could no longer be pulled apart. The export machine did not just make things, it made modern China. If you want to understand the true physical scale of China's transformation, you do not need to look at a bank statement or a stock market chart. You only need to look out the window of a train. In the 1980s, a journey across China was a test of endurance. The trains were painted green, and they moved with a slow, heavy rhythm. They smelled of coal smoke, instant noodles, and sweat. The windows were often open to let in the air, which meant the dust of the countryside covered everything. A trip from Beijing to Shanghai took nearly 20 hours of rattling and shaking. The roads were even worse. They were often narrow strips of dirt or broken pavement, clogged with bicycles, tractors, and animals. Moving goods from one side of the country to the other was a slow, expensive nightmare. Today, that same journey is like flying without leaving the ground. You sit in a white, sleek silver tube that looks like a spaceship. The air is cool and silent. You look at a digital screen and see that you are moving at 350 kilometers an hour, but your cup of tea sits perfectly still on your tray table. The rice paddies and mountains blur into streaks of green and gray outside the glass. The trip that took a day and a night now takes just over 4 hours. This chapter is about the bones and arteries of the nation. It is about how China poured more concrete in 3 years than the United States poured in the entire 20th century. It is the story of the greatest construction project in human history. To build a modern economy, you need more than just factories. You need a way to move things. You need to get coal to the power plants, steel to the cities, and finished products to the ports. The leaders of China understood that infrastructure was the key to unlocking wealth. They looked at the history of rich nations and saw that they all had strong networks of transport. So China decided to build everything, all at once. The speed at which this happened is almost impossible to believe. In most countries, building a new subway line or a major highway takes 10 or 20 years of planning, arguing, and legal battles. In China, entire subway systems appeared in the blink of an eye. Shanghai, for instance, had no subway system at all in 1990. Today, it has the longest subway network in the world, a sprawling web of tunnels that carries millions of people every day. The crown jewel of this effort is the high-speed rail network. At the turn of the millennium, China had no high-speed trains. They looked at Japan and Europe and decided they wanted to beat them at their own game. In just 15 years, they laid down enough track to wrap around the earth. Today, China has more high-speed rail than all the other countries in the world combined. These tracks are not just metal bars on the ground. They are economic lifelines. They connect the rich cities on the coast with the poorer cities in the west. They allow a businessman to have breakfast in Beijing, a meeting in Shanghai, and be home for dinner. They shrank the country, but the ambition did not stop at trains. The Chinese engineers looked at their mighty rivers and decided to tame them. The Yangtze River is the long, winding soul of China, but it was also a source of deadly floods for centuries. To control it and to generate electricity for a growing nation, the government built the Three Gorges Dam. It is a structure so massive that it is hard to comprehend. It is made of enough concrete to build 60 Eiffel Towers. The reservoir behind the dam stretches for hundreds of miles, a man-made sea deep in the heart of the country. When the water level rose, it swallowed entire cities, ancient temples, and over 1,000 villages. Over 1 million people had to pack their bags and move to new homes. The dam generates so much electricity that it powers huge, distinct regions of the country. It stands as a monument to the idea that man can conquer nature, a symbol of raw power and will. The philosophy of construction in China was unique. In the West, cities usually grow slowly. A few houses are built, then a shop, then a road, and eventually it becomes a town. China turned this logic upside down. They started building cities before the people even arrived. Travelers in the early 2000s often reported seeing ghost cities. These were vast areas filled with tall apartment towers, wide boulevards, government buildings, and shopping malls, but with no people. Western critics laughed and said this was a bubble that would burst. They said it was a waste of money. But the Chinese planners were playing a longer game. They knew that millions of farmers were moving to the cities every year. They were building the bucket before the rain fell. One famous example is the Pudong district in Shanghai. In 1990, it was nothing but swampy farmland and warehouses across the river from the historic city center. The government pointed at the mud and said, "This will be the financial capital." They built the skyscrapers first. Today, that skyline is one of the most famous in the world, home to some of the tallest towers on Earth and bustling with millions of workers. The ghost cities eventually filled up. The empty roads became jammed with traffic. This infrastructure created a cycle of growth that fed itself. Because the roads were good, a factory could open in a remote province and still get its goods to the port in 2 days. Because the trains were fast, Workers could move easily to where the jobs were. Because the power grid was reliable, machines did not stop running. Good infrastructure lowered the cost of doing business. It was like greasing the gears of a giant machine. However, we must ask how they did it so fast. Why could China build a bridge in a month when it takes other countries a year? The answer lies in the political system. In many democratic countries, the government must listen to the complaints of every citizen. If you want to build a train track through a neighborhood, the people living there can sue to stop you. They can protest. The process is slow because the rights of the individual are placed above the speed of the project. In China, the state has the ultimate power. If the government decides that a high-speed train must go from point A to point B, it will go there. If a village is in the way, the village is removed. The residents are given compensation and moved to new apartments, often whether they want to go or not. There is no long debate. There are no years of court cases. This power allows for incredible speed. It allows the government to look at a map, draw a line, and make it real. This speed is a double-edged sword. It is a great strength because it allows the country to modernize and solve problems quickly. But it also has a human cost. Many people lost their ancestral homes. Many historic neighborhoods, full of memories and culture, were bulldozed to make way for wide, soulless highways. The environment also paid a heavy price. The demand for cement and steel to build all these structures created massive amounts of pollution. The dust from construction sites hung over cities like a gray blanket for years. There were also times when the speed led to mistakes. In the rush to build, safety was sometimes ignored. In 2011, two high-speed trains collided near the city of Wenzhou. It was a tragedy that shocked the nation. It made people pause and ask if they were moving too fast. It forced the government to slow down, just a little, and focus on safety and quality rather than just pure speed. Yet despite the costs and the controversies, the achievement remains undeniable. China did not just patch up its old roads. It built an entirely new skin for the country. They built bridges that soar over canyons, suspended in the clouds. They built tunnels that bore through solid rock for miles. They built airports that look like starfish from the sky, handling more passengers than any others in the world. This physical transformation changed the psychology of the people. When you live in a country that is constantly being built, you feel a sense of momentum. You see the future rising around you every day. A child growing up in a remote village today is connected to the world in a way their parents never were. The road outside their door is paved. The internet cable runs to their house. The train can take them to the capital. Chapter 7 is the story of concrete and steel, but it is really a story about connection. By knitting the country together with iron rails and asphalt ribbons, China turned itself from a collection of isolated provinces into a single, powerful unit. The infrastructure is the stage upon which the rest of the economic miracle was performed. Without the roads, the goods would not move. Without the dams, the lights would not turn on. It was a gamble of trillions of dollars, paid for with sweat and sacrifice, that laid the foundation for the superpower we see today. If you want to understand the true physical scale of China's transformation, you do not need to look at a bank statement or a stock market chart. You only need to look out the window of a train. In the 1980s, a journey across China was a test of endurance. The trains were painted green, and they moved with a slow, heavy rhythm. They smelled of coal smoke, instant noodles, and sweat. The windows were often open to let in the air, which meant the dust of the countryside covered everything. A trip from Beijing to Shanghai took nearly 20 hours of rattling and shaking. The roads were even worse. They were often narrow strips of dirt or broken pavement, clogged with bicycles, tractors, and animals. Moving goods from one side of the country to the other was a slow, expensive nightmare. Today, that same journey is like flying without leaving the ground. You sit in a white, sleek silver tube that looks like a spaceship. The air is cool and silent. You look at a digital screen and see that you are moving at 350 kilometers an hour, but your cup of tea sits perfectly still on your tray table. The rice paddies and mountains blur into streaks of green and gray outside the glass. The trip that took a day and a night now takes just over 4 hours. This chapter is about the bones and arteries of the nation. It is about how China poured more concrete in 3 years than the United States poured in the entire 20th century. It is the story of the greatest construction project in human history. To build a modern economy, you need more than just factories. You need a way to move things. You need to get coal to the power plants, steel to the cities, and finished products to the ports. The leaders of China understood that infrastructure was the key to unlocking wealth. They looked at the history of rich nations and saw that they all had strong networks of transport. So China decided to build everything, all at once. The speed at which this happened is almost impossible to believe. In most countries, building a new subway line or a major highway takes 10 or 20 years of planning, arguing, and legal battles. In China, entire subway systems appeared in the blink of an eye. Shanghai, for instance, had no subway system at all in 1990. Today, it has the longest subway network in the world, a sprawling web of tunnels that carries millions of people every day. The crown jewel of this effort is the high-speed rail network. At the turn of the millennium, China had no high-speed trains. They looked at Japan and Europe and decided they wanted to beat them at their own game. In just 15 years, they laid down enough track to wrap around the earth. Today, China has more high-speed rail than all the other countries in the world combined. These tracks are not just metal bars on the ground. They are economic lifelines. They connect the rich cities on the coast with the poorer cities in the west. They allow a businessman to have breakfast in Beijing, a meeting in Shanghai, and be home for dinner. They shrank the country, but the ambition did not stop at trains. The Chinese engineers looked at their mighty rivers and decided to tame them. The Yangtze River is the long, winding soul of China, but it was also a source of deadly floods for centuries. To control it and to generate electricity for a growing nation, the government built the Three Gorges Dam. It is a structure so massive that it is hard to comprehend. It is made of enough concrete to build 60 Eiffel Towers. The reservoir behind the dam stretches for hundreds of miles, a man-made sea deep in the heart of the country. When the water level rose, it swallowed entire cities, ancient temples, and over 1,000 villages. Over 1 million people had to pack their bags and move to new homes. The dam generates so much electricity that it powers huge, distinct regions of the country. It stands as a monument to the idea that man can conquer nature, a symbol of raw power and will. The philosophy of construction in China was unique. In the West, cities usually grow slowly. A few houses are built, then a shop, then a road, and eventually it becomes a town. China turned this logic upside down. They started building cities before the people even arrived. Travelers in the early 2000s often reported seeing ghost cities. These were vast areas filled with tall apartment towers, wide boulevards, government buildings, and shopping malls, but with no people. Western critics laughed and said this was a bubble that would burst. They said it was a waste of money. But the Chinese planners were playing a longer game. They knew that millions of farmers were moving to the cities every year. They were building the bucket before the rain fell. One famous example is the Pudong district in Shanghai. In 1990, it was nothing but swampy farmland and warehouses across the river from the historic city center. The government pointed at the mud and said, "This will be the financial capital." They built the skyscrapers first. Today, that skyline is one of the most famous in the world, home to some of the tallest towers on Earth and bustling with millions of workers. The ghost cities eventually filled up. The empty roads became jammed with traffic. This infrastructure created a cycle of growth that fed itself. Because the roads were good, a factory could open in a remote province and still get its goods to the port in 2 days. Because the trains were fast, workers could move easily to where the jobs were. Because the power grid was reliable, machines did not stop running. Good infrastructure lowered the cost of doing business. It was like greasing the gears of a giant machine. However, we must ask how they did it so fast. Why could China build a bridge in a month when it takes other countries a year? The answer lies in the political system. In many democratic countries, the government must listen to the complaints of every citizen. If you want to build a train track through a neighborhood, the people living there can sue to stop you. They can protest. The process is slow because the rights of the individual are placed above the speed of the project. In China, the state has the ultimate power. If the government decides that a high-speed train must go from point A to point B, it will go there. If a village is in the way, The village is removed. The residents are given compensation and moved to new apartments, often whether they want to go or not. There is no long debate. There are no years of court cases. This power allows for incredible speed. It allows the government to look at a map, draw a line, and make it real. This speed is a double-edged sword. It is a great strength because it allows the country to modernize and solve problems quickly. But it also has a human cost. Many people lost their ancestral homes. Many historic neighborhoods, full of memories and culture, were bulldozed to make way for wide, soulless highways. The environment also paid a heavy price. The demand for cement and steel to build all these structures created massive amounts of pollution. The dust from construction sites hung over cities like a gray blanket for years. There were also times when the speed led to mistakes. In the rush to build, safety was sometimes ignored. In 2011, two high-speed trains collided near the city of Wenzhou. It was a tragedy that shocked the nation. It made people pause and ask if they were moving too fast. It forced the government to slow down, just a little, and focus on safety and quality rather than just pure speed. Yet despite the costs and the controversies, the achievement remains undeniable. China did not just patch up its old roads. It built an entirely new skin for the country. They built bridges that soar over canyons, suspended in the clouds. They built tunnels that bore through solid rock for miles. They built airports that looked like starfish from the sky, handling more passengers than any others in the world. This physical transformation changed the psychology of the people. When you live in a country that is constantly being built, you feel a sense of momentum. You see the future rising around you every day. A child growing up in a remote village today is connected to the world in a way their parents never were. The road outside their door is paved. The internet cable runs to their house. The train can take them to the capital. Chapter 7 is the story of concrete and steel, but it is really a story about connection. By knitting the country together with iron rails and asphalt ribbons, China turned itself from a collection of isolated provinces into a single, powerful unit. The infrastructure is the stage upon which the rest of the economic miracle was performed. Without the roads, the goods would not move. Without the dams, the lights would not turn on. It was a gamble of trillions of dollars, paid for with sweat and sacrifice, that laid the foundation for the superpower we see today. If you want to see the true wealth of modern China, do not look at the vaults of its banks or the concrete of its dams. Look instead at the heads of its children. The story of China's rise is often told through steel and cement, but the most important material in this transformation was the human mind. Chapter 8 is the story of how a country of farmers became a country of engineers, and how a nation that once burned books decided to build the largest education system the world has ever seen. To understand the magnitude of this change, we must remember the silence that once fell over the classrooms. During the chaotic years of the Cultural Revolution, schools were closed. Teachers were humiliated. Knowledge was considered dangerous. A whole generation lost the chance to learn. When the dust settled in the late 1970s, China was left with a population where many people could not read a simple newspaper. The literacy rate was only about 66%. This meant that out of every 3 people you met, 1 could not write their own name. You cannot build a modern computer or run a complex factory if you cannot read the manual. The leaders who took over, led by Deng Xiaoping, understood that the country was broken. They knew that muscles alone could not lift China out of poverty. They needed brains. In 1977, they made a decision that signaled the return of hope. They restarted the National College Entrance Exam, known as the Gaokao. When the news broke that the exam was coming back, it was like rain falling on a desert. 5.7 million people, ranging from teenagers to men in their 30s who had been working in the fields, rushed to take the test. They studied by candlelight in freezing farmhouses. They memorized textbooks while working in factories. For them, this test was the only door out of a hard life. It was the first time in a decade that talent mattered more than political background. This was the spark, but the fire took time to build. The government began a massive campaign to fix the foundation. They made a rule that every child in China had to go to school for at least 9 years. This sounds normal to us now, but in a poor country where children were needed to help harvest rice or look after animals, it was a revolution. Village by village, the change happened. In the mountains and the deserts, simple concrete schools replaced mud huts. Teachers were sent to the deepest countryside. The slogan was simple: knowledge changes destiny. Parents who had spent their lives with their backs bent in the fields looked at their children and saw a different future. They were willing to sacrifice everything, their savings, their comfort, their food, so that their child could sit at a desk instead of standing in the mud. The result of this effort was one of the greatest achievements in human history. In just a few decades, the literacy rate jumped from 66% to over 96%. Among young people today, it is essentially 100%. This created a workforce that was not just large, but capable. When the foreign factories arrived, as we saw in earlier chapters, they found workers who could read instructions, do math, and learn new skills quickly. But basic reading and writing were not enough. The government looked at the United States and Europe and saw that the most powerful nations were the ones with the best universities. In the 1990s, China decided to expand its university system at a speed that was dizzying. They did not just build new classrooms, they built entirely new university towns. They merged small colleges into giant super universities. The number of students grew exponentially. In nearly every major city, forests of cranes appeared, building libraries, dormitories, and laboratories. In 1998, barely 3 million students were enrolled in higher education. Today, that number is over 40 million. China now produces more university graduates every year than the United States and Europe combined. The subjects they studied were chosen with a specific purpose. The government knew they needed to build roads, bridges, cities, and power grids. So, they pushed for engineering. They created an army of engineers. If you throw a stone on a Chinese university campus, you are likely to hit an engineering student. They learned how to build skyscrapers that could withstand typhoons. They learned how to build high-speed trains. They learned the chemistry of new materials. This flood of technical talent is the reason China could physically transform itself so fast. There was another subject that became an obsession: English. The Chinese leadership realized that English was the language of global business, science, and the internet. If China wanted to connect with the world, its people had to speak the world's language. English became a fever. In the parks of Beijing and Shanghai, you could see thousands of people in the early morning mist, holding books and shouting English words aloud to practice their pronunciation. Grandparents learned hello and thank you. Children started learning it in kindergarten. It is estimated that there are more people learning English in China today than there are people in the United States. This linguistic bridge allowed Chinese engineers to read American technical journals. It allowed Chinese salespeople to sell goods to customers in London and New York. It removed the wall of silence between China and the outside world. However, the government was humble enough to know that they could not teach everything at home. They knew that the best knowledge was still found in the universities of the West. So, they did something brave. They opened the gates and encouraged their brightest students to leave. They sent hundreds of thousands of students to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. They studied at Harvard, MIT, and Oxford. There was a great fear among some leaders that these students would never come back. They worried they would taste the freedom and wealth of the West and stay there forever. This was called the brain drain. But Deng Xiaoping was not worried. He believed that if China grew strong, they would return. He was right. While many stayed, many others came back. They returned with PhDs in physics, degrees in business management, and knowledge of how modern financial markets work. These returnees were given a nickname. They were called sea turtles, because sea turtles swim across the vast ocean, but always return to the beach where they were born to lay their eggs. These sea turtles started technology companies. They became professors. They brought the best ideas from the world and planted them in Chinese soil. The culture of education in China became intense. Because of the one-child policy, most families had only one child. That single child became the center of the universe for 2 parents and 4 grandparents. All the hopes and dreams of the entire family rested on that one pair of small shoulders. This created a pressure cooker environment. The entrance exam, the Gaokao, became the most important event in a young person's life. It is often described as thousands of soldiers and horses crossing a single log bridge. For 2 days every June, the entire country goes quiet. Construction work stops near schools, so the students are not disturbed. Police escorts clear traffic for buses carrying students. Mothers wait outside the gates in traditional dresses, praying for good luck. A high score on this test means you get into a top university, which leads to a good job, which leads to a high salary, which allows you to take care of your aging parents. A low score can mean a life of struggle. This pressure is heavy, and many critics say it kills creativity and makes children too stressed. But it also created a culture where hard work and study are valued above almost anything else. It taught a generation that if you want to succeed, you must sit down, open the book, and put in the effort. By the 2000s and 2010s, the quality of this human capital began to show. China was no longer just making cheap plastic toys. It was beginning to design things. The engineers who had been trained in the new universities began to build space stations. They built deep-sea submersibles. They created their own versions of the internet giants. Companies like Huawei and Alibaba were not built by farmers. They were built by the highly educated generation that the reforms had created. This shift changed the perception of the Chinese worker. In the 80s, the image was of a factory girl sewing a button. Today, the image is of a researcher in a white lab coat peering into a microscope. The country moved from relying on the strength of its back to relying on the sharpness of its mind. This chapter is arguably the most important one for the long-term future of China. Factories can rust, roads can crack, but education is an investment that compounds over time. When you teach a woman to read, she teaches her children. When you train a scientist, he trains a team. The decision to prioritize education was the ticket that allowed China to board the train of modernization. It was not an easy path. It was paved with the sweat of millions of students studying late into the night and the sacrifice of millions of parents who wore old clothes so their children could buy books. But as we look at China today, a nation that is landing rovers on the dark side of the moon, and leading the world in renewable energy research. We see the harvest of those seeds planted 40 years ago. The dark period of ignorance has been replaced by the bright light of knowledge, and that light has illuminated the path to a better life for over 1 billion people. There was a time, not so long ago, when the world looked at China and saw a giant copy machine. If you walked through the electronics markets of Shenzhen in the early 2000s, you would see shelves stacked high with phones that looked exactly like a Nokia or a Samsung. But if you looked closely, the spelling on the logo was slightly wrong. The screen was a little dim. The buttons felt loose. These were the days when China was known for making Shanzhai goods, a word that originally meant a bandit stronghold but came to mean fake or copycat products. The world laughed at these clumsy imitations. They said that China could copy the shell of a machine, but it could never build the soul. But while the world was laughing, China was learning. Chapter 9 tells the story of the greatest magic trick in modern economic history. It is the story of how a student who started by tracing the drawings of the master eventually learned to paint a masterpiece that the master himself could not understand. To comprehend this journey, we must look at copying not as theft, but as a desperate form of education. When China opened its doors, it was decades behind in science and technology. They did not have time to reinvent the wheel. So they took the wheels that the West had made, took them apart, studied every spoke and every screw, and learned how to build them. This process of reverse engineering was the classroom for an entire generation of engineers. They started by assembling phones for American companies. They spent years looking at how the circuits were soldered and how the glass was cut. Slowly, the knowledge soaked in. They realized that they did not just have to assemble the parts, they could make the parts. And if they could make the parts, they could design the phone. The shift began to happen in industries like home appliances and motorcycles, but it became most visible in the world of smartphones and cars. For years, Chinese cars were considered jokes on wheels. They were seen as unsafe and ugly. But the Chinese car makers did not give up. They hired designers from Germany and Italy. They bought battery technology. They worked harder and faster than anyone else. Today, if you look at the electric vehicle market, China is no longer following. It is leading. Companies that started by making batteries for cell phones are now building futuristic cars that talk to the driver and park themselves. The copycat phase was just the training wheels. Now, the training wheels are off. As the manufacturing base grew strong, a new kind of company began to rise from the Chinese soil. These were the tech giants, and they would change the daily life of Chinese people in ways that science fiction writers had barely dreamed of. 3 names stood taller than the rest: Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. Together, they created a digital world that is entirely separate from the rest of the internet, yet in many ways more advanced. Let us look at Alibaba. It started in the apartment of a former English teacher named Jack Ma. He had a vision that small businesses in China could sell their goods to the world using the internet. But he faced a massive problem: trust. In China, people did not trust strangers. They certainly did not trust sending money to a stranger online for a product they had not seen. Jack Ma solved this by creating Alipay. It was a digital wallet that held the money until the customer was happy with the goods. It seems simple now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. It built a bridge of trust across a society that had been suspicious. Then there is Tencent, the creator of WeChat. To call WeChat an app is like calling a Swiss Army knife a spoon. It is an entire operating system for life. In the West, you might use WhatsApp to message, Facebook to see photos, Uber to get a ride, and Apple Pay to buy things. In China, WeChat does all of those things and more. You do not leave the app. This led to one of the most fascinating changes in modern China: the disappearance of cash. If you visit a Chinese city today, you can leave your wallet at home. You do not need credit cards. You do not need paper money. All you need is your phone. Even the grandmother selling roasted sweet potatoes on a street corner has a piece of paper with a black and white QR code printed on it. You scan the code with your phone, type in the amount, and the money moves instantly. Beggars on the street use QR codes. Musicians playing in the subway use QR codes. China skipped the era of credit cards and checks completely. and jumped straight into the future of digital money. This explosion of mobile technology created a feedback loop. Because everyone was on their phone for everything, the tech companies had vast amounts of data. They knew what people liked, where they went, and what they bought. They used this information to improve their services at lightning speed. Delivery networks became incredibly efficient. You could order a hot meal on your phone and have it delivered to your door by a scooter driver in 20 minutes for a very small fee. The convenience of life in Chinese cities began to outpace cities like New York or London. But this rise was not just about software, it was about deep technology. This brings us to Huawei. For a long time, Huawei was known for making cheap internet routers that you might hide behind your sofa. But the company poured billions of dollars into research. They hired the best mathematicians from Russia and the best engineers from Europe. They stopped copying and started inventing. They became the world leader in 5G technology, the super-fast network that connects the modern world. They built the antennas and the base stations that allow robots to talk to each other. This success was so great that it caused fear in other countries, who worried that China was becoming too powerful in the technology that runs the world. Behind all of this success was the invisible hand of the government. The leaders in Beijing looked at the world and realized that the future belonged to those who controlled technology. They did not want China to be the world's sweatshop forever, making cheap plastic toys while America made the high-tech computer chips. They wanted to move up the ladder. They launched a plan that was often misunderstood by the outside world. It was called Made in China 2025. The goal was simple but ambitious. China wanted to become self-reliant. They wanted to make their own computer chips, their own airplanes, their own medicines, and their own artificial intelligence. The government acted like a giant venture capitalist. They poured money into research parks. They gave tax breaks to high-tech companies. If a company wanted to build robots, the government gave them land and cheap electricity. They created an environment where innovation was the most important goal. They told the universities to stop just teaching theory and start solving real problems. This push was not without waste. There were failures. There were companies that took the government money and produced nothing. But in the world of innovation, you have to accept failure to get success. The sheer amount of money and effort meant that successes were inevitable. China began to file more patents than any other country. They began to publish more scientific papers. One area where this became very clear was in artificial intelligence, or AI. China has a natural advantage in AI because it has the most people and the most data. Since AI learns by looking at data, China is like a gold mine for these computer programs. Facial recognition technology in China became the most advanced in the world, used for everything from catching criminals to letting people into their apartment buildings without a key. The story of Chapter 9 is the story of a mindset shift. For 30 years, the phrase "made in China" meant assembled in China. It meant that the hard thinking had been done in California or Tokyo, and the hard work had been done in Guangdong. Today, that is no longer true. Made in China now means designed in China and invented in China. The country is no longer content to ride in the passenger seat. It wants to drive the car. It is building quantum computers that can calculate faster than anything in the West. It is building a space station to orbit the Earth. It is exploring the deepest parts of the ocean. This transition from copying to creating is the most difficult jump for a developing nation to make. Most countries get stuck in the middle. They get rich enough to make things, but not smart enough to invent things. China has broken through that ceiling. It has proven that it can run the marathon of innovation. As we look to the future, the implications are profound. A world where China is a technology superpower is a different world. It means that the next cure for a disease, the next clean energy solution, or the next revolution in how we communicate might not come from Silicon Valley. It might come from a laboratory in Beijing or a startup in Shenzhen. The student has put down the tracing paper. He has picked up his own brush. And he is painting a future that looks entirely his own. To understand the most significant event in the modern history of China, you do not need to look at a treaty or a war. You simply need to look at a map of where people sleep at night. For thousands of years, the story of China was written in the soil. It was a story of small villages, green rice paddies, and families who lived on the same plot of land for generation after generation. But in the last 40 years, that story was rewritten. The book of the soil was closed, and the book of the concrete was opened. Chapter 10 tells the story of the Great Migration. It is a movement of people so vast that it shifts the weight of the planet. Since the reforms began, roughly 500 million people have packed their bags and moved from the countryside to the cities. To help you picture this, imagine if every single person in the United States, plus everyone in Russia, plus everyone in Mexico, all decided to move house at the same time. This was not just a relocation, it was the largest migration in human history. The reason for this movement was simple and powerful. It was the difference between survival and opportunity. In the village, life was predictable but hard. A farmer's income depended on the weather. If the rains did not come, the family did not eat well. There was very little cash. You might have food, but you could not buy a television or send your child to a university. But in the cities, a new song was playing. It was the sound of construction drills and factory whistles. The cities offered something the villages could not, which was a steady wage. A young woman could leave her family farm in the interior province of Sichuan and travel to a factory town on the coast. There she might work long hours sewing shirts or assembling toys. But at the end of the month, she held something in her hand that her father never had. She held hard currency. She could save it. She could send it home. In the city, the connection between how hard you worked and how much you earned was clear. In the village, you could work all day and still be poor. The choice for millions of young people was obvious. They chose to leave. This movement created a phenomenon known as the floating population. These were people who lived in the cities but still had their hearts and their legal roots in the villages. They flowed like a tide. During the Chinese New Year, the Spring Festival, this tide would reverse. Hundreds of millions of workers would board trains and buses to go home for a few days. It is the busiest time for travel on Earth, a yearly reminder that the soul of China is still in transition between the old home and the new apartment. To house this ocean of new city dwellers, China had to embark on a building spree that the world had never seen before. If you look at old photos of cities like Shanghai or Beijing from the 1980s, you see low buildings and bicycles. Today you see forests of high-rise apartments. The government and private developers realized that land in the city was precious. They could not build out, so they built up. They created what are essentially vertical villages. Huge complexes of 30 or 40-story towers rose from the ground in a matter of months. These were not just buildings, they were machines for living. They allowed millions of people to live in a small footprint, close to the subway lines and the shopping malls. In many cases, entire new districts were created from nothing. Farmers would sell their land to the government, and a few years later, that same land would be covered in asphalt and glass, hosting a population larger than many European capitals. This concentration of people was the secret fuel for economic growth. Economists have a fancy term for this, but the concept is simple. When you put smart, hardworking people close together, magic happens. Ideas spread faster. Businesses can find the workers they need instantly. A factory in a city can order parts from a supplier down the street. A restaurant has thousands of customers walking past its door every day. By moving people from low productivity work on farms to high productivity work in factories and offices, China unlocked a massive amount of wealth. A farmer might add a few $100s of value to the economy in a year. That same person, working in a car factory, might add tens of thousands of dollars of value. By simply moving the person, the country became richer. This migration created huge hubs of specialized business. Some cities became famous for making shoes. Others became famous for making lighting fixtures. The city became a giant, efficient engine that powered the nation's rise. However, a change this fast and this big does not come without deep scars. The cities grew so fast that they sometimes forgot to breathe. The most visible cost was the environment. For many years, the sky over cities like Beijing was not blue. It was a thick, choking gray. The millions of new cars, the construction dust, and the coal-burning power plants created a blanket of smog. There were days when children were told not to go outside. People wore masks long before any pandemic, simply to keep the grit out of their lungs. The air became a symbol of the price China was paying for its speed. There was also the problem of crowding. The cities were bursting at the seams. The subways during rush hour became tests of endurance, with people packed so tightly they could barely move their arms. The noise was constant. The peace of the village was replaced by the roar of the highway. Perhaps the most painful challenge was social. China has a system called hukou, which is like a household registration or a domestic passport. If you are born in a village, you have a rural hukou. If you move to the city to work, you do not automatically get a city hukou. This created a divide. The migrants built the skyscrapers, cleaned the streets, and cooked the food, but they were often treated as second-class citizens. They could not always send their children to the good city schools. They could not always see the city doctors for the same price as the locals. This system led to the heartbreaking tragedy of the left-behind children. Because parents could not bring their children to the city or could not afford to keep them there, they often left them in the village with their grandparents. Millions of children grew up seeing their parents only once a year. They grew up with money for new clothes and school books, sent by their absent mother and father, but they grew up without their hugs. It was a sacrifice made by an entire generation, trading family time for a chance at a better future. Despite these challenges, the migration continued. The pull of the city was too strong to resist. The government tried to manage this by building even more infrastructure. They built subway lines that extended deep into the suburbs. They planted millions of trees to clean the air. They began to reform the registration system to give migrants more rights. The scale of this urbanization changed the character of the Chinese people. They became modern. In the village, life was governed by the sun and the seasons. In the city, life was governed by the clock and the calendar. People learned to navigate complex subway maps. They learned to use smartphones to pay for everything. They were exposed to new ideas, new fashions, and new foods from all over the world. A person who had never seen a foreigner in their village might now serve coffee to tourists from France or businessmen from Japan. This chapter describes a transformation that is almost biological in nature. It is like watching a caterpillar turn into a butterfly, but on a scale of hundreds of millions. The transition was messy, painful, and sometimes ugly, but it was also magnificent. It turned a rural, agricultural society into an urban, industrial powerhouse. The cities of China today are the result of this great human experiment. They are places of incredible energy and stark contradictions. You can stand on a street corner and see a migrant worker eating a simple bowl of noodles, sitting in the shadow of a luxury shopping mall that sells handbags worth more than he will earn in a lifetime. Yet, that worker stays. He stays because the city is where the future is being built, and he wants to be part of it. The Great Migration is slowing down now. The flood has become a stream, but the map has been redrawn forever. The empty fields are gone, replaced by the glowing lights of the metropolis. China has become a nation of city dwellers, and in doing so, it has changed not just its own destiny, but the rhythm of the entire world. The story of urbanization is the story of how the Chinese people voted with their feet, walking away from the poverty of the past and marching into the complex, crowded, and hopeful reality of the modern city. For many years, the story of China was told through the image of a shipping container. We looked at the massive ports of Shanghai and Shenzhen and saw thousands of metal boxes stacked like colorful bricks, waiting to be loaded onto ships bound for Los Angeles, Rotterdam, or Tokyo. The narrative was simple. China was the kitchen where the meal was cooked, but the people eating the feast lived far away across the ocean. China made the toys, but American children played with them. China stitched the shirts, but European bankers wore them. The country was an engine built for one purpose, which was to send things away. Chapter 11 tells the story of how that engine was turned around. It is the story of a sleeping giant waking up to realize that the biggest treasure chest was not across the sea, but right in its own living room. It is the discovery of the Chinese consumer. To understand this shift, we must first look at a problem that plagued China for a long time. In the past, even though China was one country on the map, economically it often acted like 30 different small countries. The provinces were like walled gardens. Local leaders wanted to protect their own factories. If a beer company in Beijing wanted to sell its beer in the neighboring province, they might face special taxes or rules designed to block them. It was often cheaper and easier to ship a container from Shanghai to San Francisco than to ship it from Shanghai to the deep interior of China. The roads were blocked by endless toll booths. The rules changed every time you crossed a borderline. The government in Beijing realized that this was a massive waste. They understood that the true power of having over 1 billion people is only real if those people can trade freely with each other. So, they began a quiet war against these barriers. They tore down the toll booths. They unified the laws. They built a national highway system that connected every corner of the map. They forced the provinces to open their gates. This created a single, massive market. Suddenly, a factory in the south could easily sell its goods to a village in the north. The blood of the economy began to flow freely through the veins of the nation. As these barriers fell, something else was happening in the pockets of the people. The decades of hard work described in previous chapters had produced a result. The people were no longer just surviving, they were beginning to thrive. A middle class was being born. In the West, we often take the idea of a consumer for granted. We are used to walking into a store and buying things we want, not just things we need. But in China, this was a new feeling. For a long time, a family bought a coat because it was cold. Now they bought a coat because it looked fashionable. They bought a washing machine not just to clean clothes, but to save time. They bought cars not just for transport, but for status. This group of people, the middle class, grew to include hundreds of millions of souls. Imagine a group of people larger than the entire population of the United States, all suddenly having extra money to spend at the same time. It was an explosion of demand. They wanted better food. They wanted safer baby milk. They wanted cosmetics, movies, and travel. Foreign companies who had originally come to China just to use the cheap workers suddenly realized they had made a mistake. They looked around and saw that the workers were now also customers. Companies like General Motors found that they were selling more cars in China than in America. Starbucks opened thousands of stores because the Chinese people developed a taste for coffee and a place to sit with friends. The sign on the door changed from "Help Wanted" to "Open for Business." But the physical stores were only half the story. The real revolution happened in the digital world. This is where China leaped ahead of everyone else. In many Western countries, people were used to driving to big shopping malls to buy their goods. China had malls too, and they built them by the thousands. But the Chinese people fell in love with shopping on their phones. Because the internet arrived at the same time as the rise of wealth, the two grew up together. Companies created online marketplaces that were like digital bazaars. You could buy anything. You could buy a bag of rice, a live crab, a diamond ring, or a giant television, and you could do it while sitting on the subway. The most famous event that showed this power is known as Singles Day. It happens on the 11th of November every year. It started as a small anti-Valentine's Day joke for single people, but it turned into the biggest shopping event in the history of the planet. On this one day, Chinese consumers spend billions of dollars in 24 hours. They buy more in one day than many countries spend in a whole year. It is a frenzy of commerce that proves the incredible depth of the Chinese pocket. To make this online shopping work, China built a delivery network that is a marvel of human organization. If you walk down any street in a Chinese city, you will see them. They are the armies of drivers on electric scooters, wearing blue, yellow, or red helmets. They weave through traffic with boxes strapped to the back of their bikes. They are the red blood cells of the new economy. Because of these drivers and the sophisticated computer systems behind them, a person living in a tiny remote village on the side of a mountain can order a pair of shoes from a factory in the city and have them delivered to their door in 2 days. This connected the rural people to the modern world. It meant that a farmer did not have to move to the city to buy city goods. The city came to him. This shift to an internal market became critical around the year 2010. Before this, China was terrified of what would happen if the West stopped buying its exports. When the global financial crisis hit in 2008, factories in China closed because Americans and Europeans had no money. This scared the Chinese leadership. They realized they were too dependent on others. They decided that they needed to stand on two legs. One leg was exports, but the other, stronger leg had to be domestic consumption. They wanted their own people to buy the goods. This would make the country safe. If the world economy crashed, China could keep running by selling to itself. The government encouraged this. They lowered taxes on buying cars. They gave subsidies for people in the countryside to buy refrigerators and televisions. They wanted the money to spin around inside China's borders. This change fundamentally altered the relationship between China and the world. China was no longer just a humble supplier. It was a prize. Every major company on Earth knew that if they wanted to grow, they had to win in China. Hollywood movies began to change their scripts to appeal to Chinese audiences because the ticket sales in China were so huge. Phone makers designed screens that were bigger because Chinese users preferred them. The gravity of the global economy shifted toward the East. The power of having over 1 billion customers is that it allows you to do things on a scale that no one else can touch. If you invent a new product in a small country, you might sell a few thousand. If you invent it in China and it becomes a hit, you sell 10 million in a week. This allows Chinese companies to grow into giants almost overnight. It gives them the money to invest in new technology and better products. By the end of the decade, the transformation was undeniable. The streets were filled with cars driven by Chinese families on their way to malls filled with Chinese shoppers. The delivery trucks were full of packages moving from one province to another. The economy was no longer a fragile thing that relied on the kindness of strangers. It was a self-sustaining fire. Chapter 11 is the story of confidence. It is the moment when China looked in the mirror and liked what it saw. It realized that its greatest strength was not just its ability to make things, but its ability to consume them. It turned the massive population from a burden that needed to be fed into an asset that powered the future. The internal market became the stabilizer, the anchor that held the ship steady even when the storms of global politics raged outside. It proved that a nation of 1 billion people does not just need the world needs them. To understand the mystery of how China works, you must first let go of a simple idea that is taught in almost every economics classroom in the West. In the West, we are taught that there are two teams. One team is the government, and the other team is the market. We are told that these two teams are rivals. If the government is strong, the market is weak. If the market is free, the government must stay out of the way. But in China, the story is written differently. In the Chinese model, the government and the market are not enemies fighting for the ball. They are two hands belonging to the same body. Chapter 12 takes us inside the engine room of this unique system. It explains how a country can be run by a communist party while also having shopping malls, stock markets, and billionaires. This mixture is often called state capitalism, or as the Chinese leaders prefer to call it, socialism with Chinese characteristics. The best way to picture this system is to imagine a bird in a cage. This was a famous metaphor used by one of the early architects of the reforms, a man named Chen Yun. He said that the market economy is like a bird. If you hold the bird too tightly in your hand, you will crush it and it will die. This represents too much control. But if you open your hand completely and there is no cage, the bird will fly away and get lost in the storm. This represents total chaos. So, the solution is to let the bird fly, but keep it inside a large, safe cage. The bird is the free market, where people buy and sell. The cage is the government plan, which sets the boundaries and the direction. In this system, the government does not try to make every shoe or bake every loaf of bread. They realized long ago that the government is terrible at making fashion choices or running restaurants. They leave those things to the private business people, the shopkeepers, and the entrepreneurs we met in earlier chapters. However, the government kept a very tight grip on what they call the commanding heights of the economy. These are the industries that are the lifeblood of the nation. Imagine the economy as a house. The government allows private people to decorate the rooms, choose the furniture, and paint the walls. But the government owns the foundation, the water pipes, and the electrical wiring. The biggest examples of this are the banks and the energy companies. In China, the largest banks are not owned by private investors. they are owned by the state. This gives the government a superpower. If the leaders decide that the country needs more highways, they can tell the banks to lend money to construction companies. If they decide the country needs to build solar panels, the money flows to solar panel factories. In a purely capitalist country, banks lend money only to make a profit. In China, banks lend money to make a profit, but also to help the country reach its national goals. The same is true for oil, electricity, and telecommunications. The giants of industry, the companies that pump the gas and run the phone networks, are state-owned enterprises. They are massive organizations that answer to Beijing. This ensures that the most vital resources are never fully controlled by private individuals or foreign countries. It provides a sense of security for the leadership, knowing that they hold the keys to the car, even if they let others sit in the passenger seats. Guiding all of this is the Communist Party. In the West, a political party is a group that tries to win elections every few years. In China, the party is more like the nervous system of the body. It is everywhere. It is not just in the government buildings, it is inside the companies themselves. Most large companies in China, even the private ones, have a party committee. This is a group of employees who are party members. Their job is to make sure that the company is not just making money, but is also moving in the same direction as the nation. This brings us to the heartbeat of the Chinese system, the 5-year plan. In many countries, politicians have a hard time thinking past the next election. They promise things that will happen in 2 or 3 years. In China, the timeline is much longer. Every 5 years, the government gathers its smartest experts, scientists, and economists. They look at the world and ask, where do we want to be in 5 years? They write a massive, detailed document that sets specific targets. For example, a plan might say, in the next 5 years, we will build 20,000 miles of high-speed rail, or we will reduce pollution by 10%. Once this plan is published, it is not just a wish list, it is a marching order. Every mayor of every city, every governor of every province, and every boss of a state-owned company looks at the plan and adjusts their work to match it. It creates a rhythm for the entire nation. It allows businesses to know exactly where the wind is blowing. If the 5-year plan says the government wants to support green energy, a smart businessman knows that starting a battery factory is a safe bet. This ability to plan creates a distinct advantage: speed and mobilization. Because the state controls the land, the money, and the rules, it can make things happen with breathtaking speed. We saw this in earlier chapters with the building of infrastructure. If the government decides a bridge needs to be built, there are no years of lawsuits or debates. The resources are gathered, the workers are summoned, the bridge gets built. When a crisis hits, this system shows its true strength. During the global financial crisis of 2008, while the rest of the world was freezing in panic, China mobilized its state resources instantly. The government told the state banks to lend, and they told the state construction companies to build. They poured concrete and steel into the economy to keep it moving. It was like injecting adrenaline directly into the heart. It worked. China kept growing while others shrank. However, this heavy control comes with a cost, and this is where the debate begins. Critics of the system argue that the visible hand of the state can be clumsy. State-owned companies are often not as efficient as private ones, because they know the government will always save them if they fail. They can become lazy. They might employ too many people or waste money on fancy buildings. They soak up a lot of the money from the banks, leaving the smaller private companies, who are often the true innovators, starving for cash. There is also the risk of making a big mistake. If the government decides to go in the wrong direction, the whole country marches in the wrong direction. In a free market, if one company makes a bad decision, only that company fails. In a state-planned system, a bad plan can hurt everyone. We saw this in the tragic days of the Great Leap Forward. While modern planning is much more scientific and careful, the danger of centralized error is always there. Furthermore, this system creates a complicated relationship between money and power. When the government decides who gets the loans and who gets the land, it creates opportunities for corruption. A businessman might spend more time trying to make friends with a government official than trying to improve his product. It creates a landscape where success often depends on guanxi, or connections, rather than just hard work. The debate over whether this control is helpful or harmful is ongoing. Supporters say that for a developing country trying to catch up, you need a strong captain to steer the ship through rough waters. They argue that without the state's strong hand, China would have collapsed into chaos or been swallowed by foreign powers. They point to the clean energy sector, where China leads the world, as proof that state planning can drive innovation. On the other side, economists argue that as China becomes a rich, complex country, the state needs to step back. They say that a government cannot plan a high-tech economy as easily as it can plan a steel industry. You can order a factory to produce 1 million tons of steel, but you cannot order a scientist to invent a new microchip by Tuesday. Innovation requires freedom and the ability to take risks, things that government planners are not always good at. Chapter 12 leaves us with a picture of a unique machine. It is a hybrid, something that the world had never seen before. It is not the rigid communism of the Soviet Union, which collapsed because it tried to control everything. Nor is it the freewheeling capitalism of the United States, where the market is king. It is a middle path. It is a system where the state holds the map and steers the wheel, but the engine is powered by the desire for profit. This balance between control and freedom is the secret tension that defines modern China. It is a dance between the bird and the cage. As the bird grows stronger and larger, the cage has had to expand. The question for the future is whether the cage will one day become too small for the bird, or if the master of the cage will find a way to let the bird fly even higher without losing the string that tethers it to the earth. To understand the true engine of China's economic miracle, you must look away from the giant government buildings and the massive state-owned dams. You must look instead at the small, dusty side streets and the neon-lit office towers where individuals dared to dream. Chapter 13 tells the story of the most powerful force in economics, which is the simple desire of a human being to build something of their own. It is the story of how the Chinese people were finally given permission to unleash their energy, creating a wave of private enterprise that started as a trickle and became a tsunami. For a long time, the idea of a private business in China was not just impossible, it was illegal. In the strict days of the past, buying something for one price and selling it for a higher price was called speculation. It was considered a crime against society. If a farmer tried to sell a few eggs on the roadside, he could be arrested. If a cobbler tried to fix shoes for money, he was seen as a capitalist tail that needed to be cut off. The state provided your job, your food, and your housing. There was no room for personal ambition. But as the 1980s began, the ice started to crack. It began with the most humble people in society. These were people who had no jobs in the state factories and no land in the countryside. The government, realizing it could not employ everyone, quietly allowed them to start small businesses. They were called getihu, which simply means an individual household. Imagine a man setting up a small stall to fix bicycles. Imagine a woman waking up at 4 in the morning to make dumplings to sell to commuters. These were the pioneers. At first, they were looked down upon. People with government jobs called them names. They were seen as desperate people who had no iron rice bowl to eat from. But a funny thing happened. These desperate people started to have money. While the factory manager was earning a fixed low wage, the dumpling seller was stuffing cash into her mattress. The bicycle repairman was buying a television. There is a famous story from this time about a man named Nian Guangju. He was a simple man who sold sunflower seeds in Anhui province. His seeds were delicious, and he was a good businessman. He started with a small stand, but soon he had so many customers that he had to hire assistants. He hired 3 people, then 5, then more than 10. This created a panic among the local officials. According to the strict theories of Karl Marx, if you hired more than 7 people, you were no longer a worker. You were a capitalist exploiting others. The officials wanted to shut him down. The case went all the way up to Deng Xiaoping. The wise leader looked at the situation and said, "Let us wait and see. If we hurt this man, it will make people anxious." This wait-and-see attitude was the green light. It told the people that it was safe to try. While the individuals were selling seeds and buttons in the cities, an even bigger revolution was happening in the countryside. This is one of the most unique parts of the Chinese story, involving something called Township and Village Enterprises, or TVEs. These were strange hybrid creatures. They were factories that were not owned by the central government in Beijing, but they were not exactly owned by private individuals either. They were owned by the local town or the village collective. They were like a community team. Because they were small and local, they could move fast. They did not have to wait for permission from the capital to buy a new machine or change the price of their bricks. Farmers who had been freed from the fields by the agricultural reforms we discussed earlier needed work. They poured into these village factories. They made cement. They wove socks. They canned fruit. These factories were often dirty and loud, and the workers had muddy legs, but they were incredibly efficient. They produced goods that people actually wanted to buy, unlike the big state factories that produced goods no one needed. In the 1980s, these village enterprises grew like wild grass. They exploded out of the ground without any real planning from the top. They became the golden bridge between the old farming economy and the new industrial economy. They taught millions of farmers how to be factory workers and managers. Then came the 1990s, and the mood shifted again. The government signaled that making money was not just allowed, it was glorious. This led to a social phenomenon known as shihai, which translates to jumping into the sea. The sea was the open market. Thousands of people who had safe, boring jobs in government offices or universities decided to quit. They jumped into the rough waters of private business. Professors became real estate developers. Bureaucrats became factory owners. These were smart, educated people, and they brought a new level of sophistication to the private sector. The private companies began to grow up. They stopped being just street stalls and village workshops. They became real corporations. This is when we saw the rise of the true Chinese entrepreneurs. These were men and women who possessed an incredible hunger. They had grown up poor, and they were determined to change their destiny. They worked 18 hours a day. They slept on the factory floor. They traveled the world to sell their products. The numbers tell a story of total domination. By the 2000s, the private sector was responsible for the vast majority of new jobs in China. There is a popular saying among economists in China called the 60-70, 80-90 combination. It means that private companies contribute 60% of the country's economic output, 70% of innovation, 80% of urban employment, and 90% of new jobs. Think about that. The government companies might own the banks and the oil wells, but the private companies are the ones employing the people. They are the ones inventing the new apps, designing the new electric cars, and delivering the packages. The private sector became the lungs of the country, breathing life into the economy every day. However, this relationship between the state and the private entrepreneur has never been simple. It is a dance of tension. On one hand, the government loves the private companies because they create wealth. They pay taxes that build the roads and the aircraft carriers. They keep the people employed and happy. But on the other hand, the government fears them. In the Chinese system, the Communist Party must always be the ultimate authority. No individual and no company can ever be more powerful than the state. This creates a delicate balancing act. The government acts like a gardener. It waters the plants and gives them fertilizer so they will grow tall and strong. But if a plant grows too tall, or if its branches start to poke over the wall, the gardener will come out with his shears and trim it back. We have seen this in recent years with the crackdown on big technology companies. When the founders of these companies started to criticize the government or act too much like independent kings, the state stepped in. They passed new laws. They issued fines. They reminded the billionaires that they were still guests in the house of the party. This is the unique contradiction of the Chinese model. In the West, we tend to think that innovation requires total freedom. We think that if the government interferes, it will kill the spirit of invention. But China is trying to prove that you can have both. They are trying to show that you can have a strong, controlling government that sets the direction, while still allowing millions of private businesses to compete and create. For the average Chinese person, the rise of private enterprise changed the texture of life. It brought color to the streets. Instead of one government store selling one type of blue jacket, there were suddenly 100 private shops selling jackets in every color of the rainbow. It brought service. A private restaurant owner treats you like a king because he wants you to come back. A state-run cafeteria worker in the old days did not care if you ate or starved. The rise of the entrepreneur also changed the dreams of the youth. In the past, the best hope for a young person was to become a soldier or a local official. Today, the dream is to be the next Jack Ma or Pony Ma. The dream is to start a company, listed on the stock market, and change the world. Chapter 13 explains that while the government built the roads and the power plants, it was the private citizens who drove the cars and built the factories that used the power. It was the unleashed energy of the people that filled the empty cities with life. The privatization was not a sudden event where the government sold everything off, as happened in some other countries. It was a slow, organic growth. It started with a few seeds sold by the roadside and grew into a forest that covered the nation. The ongoing tension remains the most important story to watch. Can the bird stay in the cage as it grows into an eagle? So far, the answer seems to be yes. The private sector continues to drive China forward, navigating the complex rules, finding holes in the walls, and constantly pushing the boundaries of what is possible. It is a testament to the resilience and creativity of the Chinese people, who, once the heavy lid was lifted just a crack, pushed it open and climbed out into the sunlight of prosperity. Every bright light casts a shadow, and the brighter the light, the deeper the shadow becomes. We have spent the last 13 chapters marveling at the speed of China's rise, watching as skyscrapers pierced the clouds and millions of people climbed out of poverty. But you cannot turn a poor country into a rich one in just 40 years without breaking things. You cannot build a factory for the world without creating smoke. You cannot move a mountain without leaving a scar on the earth. Chapter 14 is the story of the bill coming due. It is the story of the heavy price paid for the miracle. The first and most visible cost was written in the sky. For many years, the air in China's great cities was not air at all. It was a soup of chemicals and coal dust. In the rush to build factories and power plants, nobody stopped to ask where the smoke would go. It went into the lungs of the people. In Beijing, there were days when the sun was just a pale, sick disk behind a curtain of grey smog. People called it the apocalypse. Children were kept indoors for days at a time, playing in sealed rooms because the air outside was dangerous to breathe. But the damage went deeper than the sky. The water suffered too. In the countryside, where the regulations were weak, factories dumped their waste directly into the rivers. Streams that had once been clear turned colors that nature never intended, bright red, deep purple, or oily black. Farmers found that their soil was poisoned, meaning the rice they grew was tainted with heavy metals. There were whispers of cancer villages, small communities located next to chemical plants where sickness became tragically common. The land itself, which had sustained the Chinese civilization for thousands of years, was being exhausted by the demand for constant growth. While the land was cracking, the society was splitting. The economic reforms created incredible wealth, but that wealth did not fall like rain on everyone equally. It fell like a waterfall in some places and a drought in others. A deep chasm opened up between the rich and the poor. In the gleaming cities of the coast, you could see billionaires driving Ferraris past construction workers who earned a few dollars a day. You could see shopping malls selling handbags that cost more than a farmer would earn in a lifetime. This inequality created a sense of unfairness. The promise of socialism was that everyone would rise together, but the reality of this new capitalism was that some people were rising on private jets while others were still riding bicycles. The divide was not just about money, it was about opportunity. A child born in a rich Shanghai family had access to the best schools and the best doctors, while a child born in a mountain village had a classroom with a leaking roof and a teacher who was barely educated. This unfairness was made worse by a rot inside the system. Corruption became the grease that made the wheels turn. For a long time, if you wanted to get things done, if you wanted a permit to build a hotel, or if you wanted to get your child into a good school, you had to hand over an envelope filled with cash. Government officials, whose official salaries were low, became incredibly wealthy. They wore expensive watches and owned multiple homes. This corruption eroded the trust between the people and the state. It made the average person feel that the game was rigged against them, that success depended not on how hard you worked, but on who you paid. The workers who built this modern China also paid a heavy physical price. We often speak of the demographic dividend, which is a fancy way of saying there were lots of young people willing to work. But we must remember that these were human beings. In the factories, the pressure was relentless. The assembly lines moved at a dizzying speed. To meet the demands of the world, workers lived in dormitories, separated from their families, working shifts that lasted 12 or 14 hours. As the economy moved from factories to technology, the pressure followed. A culture known as 996 emerged in the tech companies. This meant working from 9 in the morning until 9 at night, 6 days a week. The young people were told that this was the price of success, but it led to burnout and exhaustion. They were running a marathon at the speed of a sprint, and their bodies and minds began to break down. Then there is the strange phenomenon of the ghost cities. In the hunger for growth, local governments and developers sometimes lost touch with reality. They borrowed massive amounts of money to build entire new cities where no one lived. They built rows of apartment towers, wide boulevards and public parks, but the people did not come. These concrete skeletons stood silent in the wind, monuments to a system that valued building things more than using them. It was a waste of steel, cement, and human effort on a colossal scale. This building spree was fueled by a mountain of debt. To keep the economy growing fast, banks lent money to anyone who wanted to build. Local governments borrowed trillions to build roads and bridges that sometimes led to nowhere. Companies took out loans to buy other companies. Beneath the shiny surface of the economy, there is a terrifying amount of money that is owed. It is like a termite infestation in a wooden house. From the outside, the house looks strong, but inside, the structure is being eaten away. The fear is that one day the bills will have to be paid, and there will not be enough money to pay them. Perhaps the most subtle cost is the change in the human heart. The rapid speed of change has left many people feeling lost. The old values of community, family, and patience were swept away by a tidal wave of materialism. In the new China, money became the only way to measure a person's worth. People speak of a moral vacuum, where strangers do not help each other because they are afraid of being scammed. The pressure to succeed has created a generation of anxious youth. They are the only children of their families, carrying the weight of their parents' and grandparents' expectations. They must study harder, work longer, and earn more. This has led to a backlash. Recently, young people have started talking about lying flat. This is a refusal to participate in the rat race. They are saying that they do not want to buy a house, or get married, or kill themselves working. They just want to exist. It is a silent protest against a society that asks for too much. So as we look at the miracle of China, we must be honest about the scars. The blue glass of the skyscrapers reflects a society that is tired, anxious, and environmentally battered. The success is real, undeniably so. The poverty is gone. The hunger is a memory. But the cost was not zero. China bought its modernity with its clean air, with the quiet peace of its villages, and with the relentless sweat of its people. This chapter is the dark movement in the symphony. It is the sound of the grinding gears and the coughing lungs. It serves as a reminder that economics is not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It is about living, breathing human beings and the planet they stand on. The leaders of China know this. They know that the old way of growing at any cost cannot continue. They know that you cannot breathe money and you cannot drink concrete. And this realization sets the stage for the final part of our story, where the giant attempts to heal its wounds and find a new path forward. We have reached the final pages of this long and winding book. After looking back at the hungry winters, the roaring factories, and the gleaming cities, we must now stand on the mountaintop and turn our eyes toward the foggy horizon. The story of China is not just a history lesson. It is a map that the rest of the world studies with intense curiosity. The most enduring lesson written on this map is the power of being practical. China succeeded because it stopped following strict beliefs and started looking at reality. It taught the world that a country does not need to have a perfect plan to begin. It just needs the courage to take the first step, the humility to fix the mistakes that arise, and the endurance to keep moving forward. It proved that you can start with nothing but mud and determination and build a skyscraper. However, other nations looking to copy this miracle find that it is not so simple. You can copy the blueprints for a bridge, and you can buy the same machines, but you cannot easily copy the unique soul of the country. The ability of the Chinese government to move an entire population in one direction is born from its specific culture and history. Other countries may find that their people will not accept such tight control. It is like trying to wear a suit that was tailored for someone else. It might cover your body, but it will not fit perfectly, and it might make it hard to walk. China showed that a strong state can build roads quickly, but that model relies on a population willing to trade some freedom for stability, a trade not every nation is willing to make. Now the road ahead is becoming steeper. The easy days are over. Economists call this the middle income trap. It is a dangerous place where many developing countries get stuck and stop growing. It happens when a country becomes too expensive to be a factory for cheap goods, but is not yet skilled enough to invent expensive technologies. China has picked all the low-hanging fruit. Now it must climb high into the tree to reach the rest. The explosive growth of the past is slowing down because a giant elephant simply cannot run as fast as a young gazelle. To survive this difficult transition, China is fundamentally changing the goal of the game. For 40 years, the obsession was quantity. It was about how much steel, how many shirts, and how many buildings could be made. Now the obsession is quality. It is no longer about making the most cars, but about making the best electric cars. It is about cleaning the gray skies and making the rivers blue again. The leadership understands that the people are no longer satisfied with just having a full belly. They want a fair society. They want to know that the wealth is not just for the billionaires in the towers, but for the families in the villages too. This push for fairness is the new engine. The future is an unwritten chapter filled with difficult questions. Can a system that relies on heavy control continue to work in an age that demands creativity and open minds? Can the economy keep growing while the population gets older and shrinks? The world watches with held breath. The experiment is not over. China has proven that it can sprint, but now it must prove that it can run a marathon, carrying the heavy weight of its own success while finding a new path through the mist. The dragon has flown higher than anyone expected, but now it must learn to glide without falling.